Russia's had some progress with their offensive in Donbass. This has resulted in territorial gains in the areas around Severodonetsk, and it seems that many people have been surprised by this development because they thought Ukraine was winning the war. And then these Russian advances have disturbed that image. So very quickly, we've seen pundits and media stories changing from Ukraine is winning to, oh, no, actually Russia's winning. So in this video, I want to look at what's happening and answer the question, is Russia winning? Over the last couple of weeks, Russia has made progress with their offensive in Donbass. Here are a couple of images from the Institute for the Study of War that show the development. One image is from May 15th and the other is from May 29th, and I'm just going to switch back and forth a couple of times. It's easy to see the difference. Specifically, the Russians have taken the area northwest of Popasna, and they have moved against the twin city of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. They have also targeted the road leading from Bakhmut to Lysychansk, which could threaten the supplies for the Ukrainian soldiers in Severodonetsk. And then east of Izum, they have taken the village of Liman. So this is a noteworthy development. Russia has actually made slow progress in Donbass for quite a while, but things have moved faster and Russia has introduced more firepower in this offensive. It seems that Ukraine was caught by surprise by the strength of these attacks and that they weren't expecting that Russia would be able to escalate so much. So to a certain extent, this is of course significant. President Zelensky has been very open that Ukraine is suffering heavy losses and that this is painful for them. He mentioned at one point that between 50 and 100 Ukrainian soldiers are killed every day as a result of this Russian offensive. That's a huge number, and in addition, there are probably 3 to 4 times as many wounded. But I also think that many people have gotten the wrong idea about the implications of Russia's advances in Donbass. It seems that many people were shocked that Russia was able to push the Ukrainians back in these areas, and that they assume that Russia is now much stronger than we used to think. So now we're seeing many takes in the media and on social media where people say that Russia is suddenly winning the war. Some people even seem to believe that Russia has gotten a decisive breakthrough and that they're going to proceed all the way to Kiev, or after Donbass they will continue with Odessa and realize the dream of Novorossiya. There are several problems with this way of reasoning. So here are a few things that I think we need to keep in mind when we try to understand what's going on. First, I will say that we should be very careful about not making assumptions about the war based on tactical events. When we look at the map where this Russian offensive is taking place, we are talking about gains and losses of just a few kilometers of terrain. We are literally discussing who is occupying which village and which part of a forest. So it's very difficult to maintain the big picture of the war when you focus on tactical events. Like, to an extent, it's like trying to understand like crime developments in society by watching where the police cars are driving. Like, you can easily get the wrong idea about how it's going. Second, I think the Russian offensive is actually going very slowly. Like, frankly, it looks like the Ukrainians are doing a pretty good job of stalling their progress. So it's definitely premature to assume that Russia is suddenly winning the whole war. Third, I think we should keep in mind that this is a war of attrition. I made a video about that, and I will include a link to it if you want to see it. But the meaning is that the really important thing is perhaps not so much whether Russia can conquer a few kilometers of terrain or even the city of Severodonetsk. The big question is how big losses the two sides are taking in that process, because it is the side that can best handle the attrition that will win in the long run. And it might take a few months before we will see how that competition of attrition plays out. Fourth, I think it's important to recognize that things will bounce back and forth at this stage in the war. A few weeks ago, we were talking about a Ukrainian offensive around Kharkiv. Then we started talking about a Russian offensive around Severodonetsk. Now we are seeing signs of Ukrainian counterattacks around Kherson. The point here is that we should be careful about interpreting all of these different developments as indicators of a broader trend. In a war, it's actually really hard to identify the turning points when they happen, and often you will only in hindsight know where the turning points were. So it's really premature when some people say that the Battle of Severodonetsk is a turning point in the war. It could be a turning point, but it could also be that we will eventually look back at the Battle of Severodonetsk as a parenthesis in the bigger war. We just don't know yet. The fifth thing is that this Russian offensive will eventually run out of energy. This is what military people like to call the point of culmination. So we don't know exactly when that will happen, but it will happen eventually because that is how these things work. And the sixth thing is that we know that the Russian forces are suffering heavy losses to make these gains around Severodonetsk. Of course, Russia hasn't published any casualty numbers, but there is plenty of anecdotal evidence that their losses are significant. And a good guess is that the Russian losses are bigger than the Ukrainian ones, because usually the attacker will take the bigger losses. And quite frankly, the way this works is that if Russia weren't taking heavy losses, then they would push harder. So the fact that they're advancing so slowly shows that they are suffering. So that was basically a list of warnings about why we should be careful not to read too much into the Russian offensive around Severodonetsk. But there are also a few areas where I think that it says something significant about the war as a whole. So here are a few reflections about why it might be important after all. I do think that this Russian offensive has been corrective to what is probably some degree of military over-optimism in Ukraine and in the West. Like, war is contingent business, and the goals change based on what happened before. And Ukraine has been very successful in the war, and I think there has been a tendency among some people, and perhaps especially among Ukrainian politicians, to get some very high expectations about what can be achieved with military force. And in my last video about frozen conflicts and wars of attrition, I actually made a subtle reference to this. I said that if there comes a point when Ukraine gets momentum and pushes the Russian back, then that will also squeeze together the Russian forces, so that over time it will become harder and harder to regain more territory. And this was actually a comment that I hadn't written into the outline for the video, but when I did the recording, I just felt I needed to include it because I just heard too many Ukrainian politicians express the idea that now they were going to throw Russia out of all of the occupied territories, including Crimea. And the first couple of times I heard that, I thought it sounded like a kind of negotiating tactic before the peace talks that will inevitably come between Ukraine and Russia. But eventually, it seemed like this is actually something that they believe that they can achieve. And it's just completely unrealistic that Ukraine can throw Russia out of Crimea. I don't know where the limits of possibility are, and perhaps they can get back to the borders from before February 24th. Maybe they can even get further than that. But I must say that Crimea is beyond my imagination for a whole range of reasons that I might go into in another video at a later time. But I do think that this offensive on Severodonetsk has been a reminder that the Russian army should not be underestimated, and that there will be limits to how big a Ukrainian victory can be. Okay, to sum up, I really don't think that the Russian offensive around Severodonetsk means that Russia is suddenly winning the war. We need to be careful not to read too much into these specific developments, because in the bigger perspective, this is still a war of attrition, and it's going to take some time before we will see the results of that mutual attrition. And in the meantime, things are going to bounce back and forth. But it is a reminder that we should not underestimate the Russian army, and that perhaps some people in Ukraine and in the West had gotten unrealistic expectations about how easy it would be to beat the Russians. And with that, I'll end it here. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again next time.